Welcome to our very special event today. I'm Ron Klein. I'm chairman of the Jewish Democratic Council of America. I'm glad so many of you could join us today for a community conversation with Georgia Senate candidates Jon Ossoff and Reverend Raphael Warnock, moderated by former U.S. Ambassador to Israel Dan Shapiro. The Jewish Democratic Council of America is the only national organization that combines Jewish values advocacy with a democratic political agenda. In the 2020 election, we mobilized nearly 2 million Jewish voters in swing states in support of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, and in support of more than 120 Democratic Senate and House candidates. As a result of our efforts, which included over 650,000 voter contacts and targeted digital ads seen by more than 45 million times, Jewish voters overwhelmingly supported Joe Biden in nearly record numbers and helped to deliver Democratic victories in critically important states like Georgia. Now we're doing everything we can to keep Georgia blue and deliver control of the Senate to Democrats by mobilizing Jewish support for both Jon Ossoff and Reverend Raphael Warnock, which is why we're here today. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce Atlanta-based JDCA board member, Michael Rosenzweig, to give us a view from Georgia. Michael?
Ron, thanks so much. And welcome to everybody who's joining us. It's quite a crowd. On November 3rd, we elected Joe Biden and Kamala Harris to restore America's soul. And we are all justifiably proud of that accomplishment. But the simple truth is that our work is not done. Since November 3rd, we have been witness to the greatest assault on our democracy in American history. And Republicans have either actively encouraged that assault or stood idly by. Those Republicans, including Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue, have made it abundantly clear that if they retain control of the Senate, they will fall in line behind Mitch McConnell and unashamedly try to obstruct Joe Biden in every way they can. So while Joe Biden's election was undoubtedly a huge achievement, if we don't win these two runoff elections in Georgia and thereby take control of the Senate, we will not have completed our task of restoring America's soul, nor will we have sent Republicans like Loeffler and Perdue the right message, that aligning themselves with a president who is aggressively trying to subvert democracy exacts a cost. Here in Georgia, we know this is going to be a very, very close election. And we at JDCA also know that just as Jewish voters played a critical role in Joe Biden's victory here in Georgia, we can make the difference in these runoffs. There are slightly more than 100,000 registered Jewish voters here in Georgia, of which 36,000 self-identify as Democrats and 50,000 are independents. So we know that if we successfully mobilize the Jewish vote in Georgia, we can play a major role in electing Jon Ossoff and Reverend Raphael Warnock. This event is an important step in that effort because today our two Democratic candidates will address nearly 2,000 of us about those issues of most concern to Jewish voters. As such, today's event is part of JDCA's larger effort in these runoffs, which includes running over 25 local and national phone banks. So please visit our website, jewishdems.org, to learn more about all the ways you can be involved. And please also stick around until the end of today's program to hear from Bobby Saferstein, JDCA's senior program advisor, about all of our upcoming events, including how you can celebrate Hanukkah with JDCA. And now it is my pleasure, my distinct pleasure, to introduce JDCA's outstanding Chief Executive Officer, Halie Soifer. Halie, please take it away.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks to everyone for being here today. The Jewish Democratic Council of America is a movement. We are a growing movement. We are proud of what we achieved on November 3rd, and we are continuing this work with all of you, advocating for our values and electing those who share our values, including Jon Ossoff and Reverend Raphael Warnock. And we are thrilled that so many of you have joined us in this effort. I want to thank our partners for today's event, Jewish Women for Joe-gia, the Jewish Democratic Women's Salon, Jews for Joe, and the Democratic Jewish Outreach of Pennsylvania, or DJOP. I also want to welcome our candidates. We have Jon Ossoff, a Georgia native, media executive, investigative journalist, and small business owner, as well as Reverend Raphael Warnock, who for the last 15 years has served as senior pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, the former pulpit of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Today's event will be moderated by U.S. Ambassador Dan Shapiro. Dan is a diplomat, a Middle East policy expert who served as the former U.S. ambassador to Israel from 2011 to 2017. Prior to his assignment in Israel, which he's never really left, and he comes to us today from Israel, Dan served as senior director for the Middle East on the National Security Council for President Obama, and prior to that, as a national security expert in Congress. Dan is a dear friend of JDCA and a critically important and valued voice in the Jewish democratic community. And we are grateful that he has joined us today to serve as our moderator. So Dan, I will now turn it over to you.
Thank you, Halie. Thanks also to Michael and Ron. Congratulations to Halie, who is who's just been appointed JDCA CEO. And I'm so grateful for your leadership and for really all who have been involved in JDCA's high impact success over this election cycle. And thank you to our audience for joining us for today's discussion. The nation's eyes are on Georgia as the Peach State will choose not one, but both of its US senators in a runoff election that concludes on January 5th. And everyone knows, as already been said, these races will determine which party has a majority in the Senate. So there's even more at stake than usual in the choices that Georgia voters will make. And as you'll soon hear, we are blessed to have two phenomenal candidates running as the Democrats in these two races, Reverend Raphael Warnock and Jon Ossoff. Now we have an audience made up both of Georgians and of others from across the country who may not know the two of you as well. Halie gave your basic introductions, but as I begin to ask some questions, and I've tried to incorporate questions that have been suggested by members of the audience, I'll turn to you to really let your voice be heard much more than mine. So if that's all right with you, Reverend and Mr. Ossoff, we'll get started. Reverend Ossoff, why don't I start with you, but I'll ask one question that both of you can answer, but Reverend, you go first. Tell our audience a bit about your background. Halie mentioned it briefly, but more that you can fill us in on your ties to the Jewish community in Georgia, and really what motivated you to run for the United States Senate this year. And if you would, reflect on what's at stake in this election for Georgia, for the Senate, and for the Biden presidency. And if you would, feel free to tell us a little something about who you're running against and the campaign they've been running. Reverend Warnock, why don't you start?
Sure. Well, thank you so very much. It's wonderful to be here with the Jewish Democratic Council of America. I'm grateful to you and the coalition of groups that have come together for this conversation, and always good to see my brother Jon Ossoff, and I'm deeply honored to be running alongside him. I've started calling him my brother from another mother, and we're in this fight together. Listen, my run for the United States Senate emerges from my ongoing life commitment to service. I grew up here in Georgia. I was born and raised in Savannah in public housing. One of 12 children in my family. I'm number 11 and the first college graduate. I know through personal experience the importance of good federal public policy, because my parents instilled in me a deep sense of a work ethic, personal responsibility. My dad used to wake me up every morning at dawn, 7 days a week. He had the sense that you just get up, you get dressed, put shoes on, you get ready. And so that has been important, and but that alone doesn't get me here. As someone now who went on to college, earned 4 degrees, including a PhD, and became the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, where Martin Luther King Jr. serves, and now running for the Senate. I wouldn't be here were it not for Pell Grants and low interest student loans, good federal public policy that connects personal responsibility. And so that has informed the work I've tried to do my entire career. I've had the honor of serving the last 15 years at Ebenezer Church. I've been involved with working with access to affordable health care, voting rights, criminal justice reform, standing up to bigotry and hatred, racism, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, wherever it shows up, whoever the source. And so this run for the Senate is a continuation of that. And I've been blessed that throughout that work, I've enjoyed really good relationships with the Jewish community. When I think about the work that I've done, for example, around criminal justice reform, it's work that I've done through building partnerships and alliances. Ebenezer Baptist Church and the Temple have long been two congregations that have enjoyed a great friendship, going back to the days when Rabbi Rothschild supported and embraced Dr. King's vision, and the Temple was bombed in 1958. And since then, these two congregations, from then until now, remain very much connected. And this shared values, shared commitment to standing up on behalf of justice. And that's been so important for the work that I've tried to do across the years.
Thank you, Reverend. Mr. Ossoff, same question to you. Tell us about what brought you here.
Well, thank you so much, Ambassador, and to the whole team at JDCA, Halie, Congressman Klein, Michael, thank you for hosting. Thank you to everybody for tuning in. It is an honor to be here alongside my friend, Reverend Warnock. And what's happening in Georgia right now is just a beautiful clarification of where Georgia is and where the South is at this moment in our history. Because you got the young Jewish journalist, son of an immigrant, bar mitzvahed at the Temple, mentored by Congressman John Lewis, running alongside the senior pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church, a preacher, a moral leader who holds the same pulpit that Dr. King did, who pastored John Lewis. And together we are building a movement for health, jobs, and justice for the people here in Georgia. And I know that Congressman Lewis is looking down on us and smiling, because the first time I ever broke bread with Congressman Lewis, he wanted to talk about the historic ties between the Jewish community and the Black community. As the Reverend mentioned, you know, the SCLC formed in Atlanta in '57, and the next year the Temple bombed. This has been an alliance of communities for decades and decades, and it's so important that we sustain and strengthen it. And to have the opportunity to defeat two incumbent senators who are like the Bonnie and Clyde of corruption in American politics, both too busy enriching themselves to take care of people suffering during this pandemic, and to build the kind of multiracial, multi-generational, progressive coalition that we are here in Georgia to win. It's a beautiful thing that's happening here. And I'm grateful to everybody who is helping to make it possible. And just a final reflection, you know, I think that that my Jewish heritage has always made me particularly sensitive to the winds of right-wing extremism, of ethno-nationalism, and in daily life, sensitive to bullying, the plight of the oppressed when the weak are taken advantage of. That's why I do the work that I do in investigative journalism and media production. I run a business that exposes war crimes, political corruption, human rights abuses. We've exposed human traffickers, death squads, war crimes committed by ISIS, atrocities committed by peacekeeping troops, judicial corruption, corporate abuses. I do that work because I'm passionate about standing up to injustice and exposing corruption. And that is the same passion that's propelled me into the political arena to fight for the people at this moment of crisis here in Georgia. So thank you again for the hospitality. I deeply appreciate it. And I want to give a special shout out to Jewish Democratic Women's Salon here in Georgia, the amazing women who have grown that organization. So formidable, so impressive. Much love to you all.
Thank you. And Mr. Robbins, I'll stay with you for a moment and just just try to maybe develop slightly the last theme you raised, and then come back to the Reverend, about the role of faith in your political life and your political work. You talked about just a moment ago your Jewish identity, the Jewish values to bring to the work. Reverend Warnock, you've of course had a career as a faith leader in your historic congregation. Just tell us a bit more about that role of faith and identity and values that you bring to your political work, and you've already reflected on those historic connections between the Black and Jewish communities in Georgia, but tell us just a bit more about it.
Ambassador, is that from? Sure.
Yeah, for you first, yeah.
Well, I am descended on my father's side from Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe who fled pogroms around the turn of the 20th century and arrived on American shores with literally nothing more than the clothes on their backs. And I imagine that many of those tuned in today have a similar family story. And in so many ways, my family has been able to live the American dream. I mean, my grandfather, who worked at a gas station pumping gas before he joined the Army Air Corps, served in World War II, came back and founded a small business with his brothers in Massachusetts. My father, the first in his family to graduate college, who went on to become an entrepreneur and help pave the way for me to have the opportunities I've had. My mother, an immigrant from Australia, who came here at 23 years old alone as a young woman because she believed in the American dream, because she believed that this country represented hope and inclusion and opportunity and equal opportunity for all. It takes a lot of courage for a 23-year-old woman in the early 1970s to pick up her life and move to the other side of the world. And she became an activist and marched for the Equal Rights Amendment. She became a citizen because she recognized that the ballot box is where we make progress in this country. But one of the things that drew me back into the political arena is that the Trump presidency and what it represented broke my mother's heart. It was a rejection of the values and ideals that had drawn her to this country, that had drawn her to become a citizen of this country and to be civically engaged. And it was a betrayal of the ideals that made this place a refuge that my father's forebears could come to when they were fleeing persecution in Lithuania and Russia. So I think that my family's story makes me, first of all, always full of empathy and concern for those who are fleeing, oppressed, facing persecution or exploitation, and also committed to ensuring that American public policy and the spirit of public leadership and civic life in America lives up to the values that drew both sides of my family to this country as immigrants.
Thank you. A very moving personal story. Reverend Warnock.
Everything that I've tried to do and the work that I have been engaged in, the campaigns that I've taken on for healthcare, for human dignity, for civil rights, all of that is informed by my faith and the values derived from my faith. Both of my parents were preachers, and they instilled that into me, passed it on to me. But early on, in addition to my parents, I was very much informed and inspired by the ministry of Martin Luther King Jr. I was born after Dr. King's death, but from childhood, I was just captivated by his powerful moral voice. He provided for me an example of a faith perspective and of a faith leader, using his faith to inspire others to build the beloved community, to engage far beyond the doors of a sanctuary. And early on, I went to Morehouse College in large measure because the spirit of Dr. King, who was long gone by then, recruited me there. I wanted to be on those grounds where head and heart came together to engage around the important issues. And so I just wanted to go to the school. I didn't know I'd end up being the pastor of the church. I just think it's so important in this moment that those of us who are people of faith and people of moral courage, who claim no faith at all, that we do not cede the conversation around faith and values to the right. That's the worst thing we could do. We cannot cede that space to the right. It is my faith that makes me insist that healthcare is a human right, that says that every voice has to be heard in our democracy, that centers the concerns of working people. And when bigotry rears its ugly head, people of faith, people of moral courage ought to be the first to stand up and push hard against it. But in America, in this moment, the loudest voices of faith too often use their faith as a weapon, as a cudgel, rather than a bridge. And so when members of the LGBTQ plus community stand up and begin to stake their claim on the American promise, to say, acknowledge our humanity, that we too deserve equal treatment under the law, which is the covenant, by the way, that we have with an American people. That's our covenant, equal protection under the law. So it's not the sectarian doctrinal dimensions of my faith that will inform my work in the Senate, but the values that I think that are in all the great faith traditions. And we have to push hard against people who use their faith as a cover for bigotry, who then, when the LGBTQ plus community stands up and they put forward these so-called religious freedom laws, these RFRA laws. And I happen to think that it will be of some value in the US Senate to have a pastor among peers to say, as I will, what do you mean that giving somebody acknowledging someone's humanity, making sure that they have equal protection, that they're not discriminated against based upon orientation or sexual identity? What do you mean that that's an affront to your religious freedom? No, it's an affront to all that is decent and moral and just, to use religion as a cover for bigotry. And so that is what will inform how I go about this work. And I think it's important that we stand up as members of respective faith communities when other faith communities or other people are attacked. And so I was much encouraged by the love and concern that my church received when we saw the horrible massacre 5 years ago in Charleston, the Charleston 9. And members of this community reached out because you know bigotry. You know what it's like to have your humanity challenged in that way. And members of this community stood up and provided much support, because we too, some folks put Confederate flags down in front of our church a few weeks after the Charleston thing, clearly trying to intimidate us. And so when the massacre occurred at Tree of Life, it was important to me to reach out to the Jewish community then and in other moments to stand in solidarity.
Thank you, both of you. Thank you. It's an inspiring description of how faith and values can be animating forces in political work, and we admire that. I'm going to turn to the subject of Israel now, a subject obviously of broad interest and concern for the broadest spectrum of the American Jewish community that supports a strong U.S.-Israel relationship. And I'll start with you, Reverend Warnock. Would love to hear you talk about your own views and commitments with respect to Israel, some of the experiences that have shaped your thinking, and obviously use this as an opportunity to clarify anything that's been said in this campaign about your views on Israel. Some of the specifics that people have raised before and during the event today have been about how, if as elected to the Senate, you'd work on issues related to Israel's security, to advancing peace between Israel and its neighbors, both Arab states and the Palestinians, U.S. security assistance to Israel, and U.S. efforts to combat the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Welcome your views on any of these specific issues.
Sure. Well, I am a staunch ally and supporter of Israel. And I echo without reservation Dr. King's perspective that Israel's right to exist as a state in security is incontestable. And so that will be reflected in my work in the Senate. I am a supporter and an advocate for the two-state solution. I see that as the viable way to a democratic Jewish state. And I'm committed to that work, and I think it deserves attention and focus and engagement. I come out of the Kingian tradition of nonviolent resistance. And so I will always affirm the right of people to protest nonviolently. But at the same time, I condemn BDS, its refusal to acknowledge Israel's right to exist. And I support President Obama's memorandum of understanding. It's the largest such commitment made in history. I think it, in as much as Israel is an important ally for us, the most important ally in that part of the world, that memo is something that I would support. Our aid and support of Israel is something that I would advance as a member of the Senate. And there's no question that Iran cannot get a nuclear weapon. We cannot allow that to happen. So there is, and in addition to that, one of the things that I've come to understand over the last few years is the relationship between Israel and the United States, but also the relationships between Israel and the state of Georgia itself, and the participation of Israeli-based companies, even down in certain parts of the state where I'm down in South Georgia, Brunswick area, these the solar panel companies and various companies that contribute to the economic development in Georgia. And so I'll be thinking about all of that as I go to the United States Senate. Now, it is clear to me that my opponents are trying to use Israel as yet another wedge issue in this campaign. And I think that's quite unfortunate. I wish I were surprised. I'm not, given some of the other things that they're throwing at me. They are worried, and they should be. But Israel, we can't allow this to become a wedge issue. We have to stay focused on the goals and on the work. I do not believe Israel is an apartheid state, as some have suggested. And there's been some comment about a sermon I gave in May of 2018. As you might imagine, I'm a pastor. I preach every Sunday. I preach a lot of sermons. And I think that as I recall that sermon, I was speaking to the issue of activists and human rights and the ability of people to be heard. At the same time, I have an increasing recognition of Hamas and the danger that they pose to the Israeli people. And so it's a complicated situation, and it's one that I will always engage as a principled and honest broker who both affirms human rights and at the same time is trying to get us to a place where Israel can exist alongside its neighbors in peace.
Thank you, Reverend. Really appreciate the detail you went through on that. Mr. Ossoff, let me turn to you with the same questions.
Sure. Well, look, this is, as the Reverend said, a strategic relationship of vital importance and a long-standing alliance that is cherished by both the United States and Israel. I've got family living in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And like the Reverend, I'm committed to Israel's security. I'm committed to Israel's security as a secure homeland for the Jewish people. And what I ultimately want is for everybody living in the region to have those basics that everyone everywhere in the world requires, which is to be able to live in security, with the freedom to practice their faiths and participate politically, without fear of terrorism, without fear of violence, without fear of persecution, to be able to flourish as human beings, build wealth for their families. That's what I want for everybody living in the Middle East. And I want the United States to play a strong role in ensuring Israel's security as a homeland for the Jewish people, and in leading diplomatic efforts to resolve this grinding 60, 70-year-old now conflict. I will work in the US Senate and look forward to working in the US Senate as a Jewish leader to promote strong American diplomacy, to bring about a lasting peace between Israelis and Palestinians so that ordinary people can go about their lives in peace, in harmony, in security, without fear, without persecution, and with their human rights intact. And I think that the United States has historically played a very constructive role in moving forward that kind of diplomacy. I hope that we can achieve a two-state solution. It will require significant political buy-in and diplomatic engagement from Israelis, from the Palestinian Authority, and from the United States. I hope that we can still get there, and look forward to doing what I can in the United States Senate to promote the strong American diplomacy necessary to get there.
Thank you. And, you know, there's so many other things we could go into in this area, the new relationships Israel is forming as it normalizes its relations with the UAE, with Bahrain, and perhaps with other nations. There's a lot of opportunities here. And I know from my work in the US Senate and of course in two administrations, that it will take strong, committed friends like you to help advance that work as well. Let me turn to some other issues because we have quite a few others while we have you. You know, the events of this year, from the Black Lives Matter protests following the murder of George Floyd, to the reckoning we're facing with systemic racism in our society, to the struggle to ensure that we live up to our democracy's highest ideals of full voting rights for all our citizens. All that's taking place against the background of a rise of incidents of racism and anti-Semitism, and under a president who has emboldened white nationalists and white supremacy. Can you tell us how those issues will shape your work in the Senate? Mr. Ossoff, let me start with you.
Well, look, you know, and I've touched on this a few times, and it is so relevant how the experience of the Jewish people throughout our history, not just in the last 200 years, but over millennia, I think has made us particularly sensitive to these currents: racism, anti-Semitism, political extremism, scapegoating, bigotry, which tend to arise at moments of social, economic, and political stress, and which our republic is founded to transcend. As the Reverend reminded us, equality under the law, a bedrock founding principle of our republic, but a principle that has yet to be fully realized. And I conceive of the American journey and American history as a process of fully realizing that ideal. And returning again to my mother's story and what drew her to American shores, it wasn't that she indulged some kind of Pollyannish fantasy about American history. She fully recognized how much further our country had to go. But she believed that America was designed and composed, and that the American spirit was such that we would continue on that journey. And that Donald Trump has been resoundingly denied a second term in office, repudiated by a margin not seen in the popular vote since Franklin Roosevelt defeated Herbert Hoover in 1932, should give us all courage, should give us all hope, should affirm for us that that spirit is alive in this country, a commitment to progress, a commitment to realizing equality under the law, a commitment to affirming that it is our shared humanity which comes before all. And what's happening in Georgia right now is a rejection of what the GOP has been running in the South since the 1970s, which is called the Southern Strategy. Since Nixon, the GOP in the South has been about dividing people along racial and cultural lines. When my opponent, David Perdue, lengthens my nose in his attack ads, vile anti-Semitism for which he has yet to apologize despite the demands of the American Jewish Committee. The disgusting race-baiting ads they're running against the Reverend, all of those politics. When my opponent gets up at a Trump rally and mocks Kamala Harris's name to belittle her South Asian heritage, that is a political playbook that will no longer work in this state, because we are building that multiracial, multi-generational coalition which rejects racism, bigotry, fear-mongering, and hate, and reminds us all, as Congressman Lewis always did, that we're all in one American house. We're all in one world house. We rise or we fall together. Our interests are overwhelmingly aligned. The things that we need aren't even that complicated. Affordable healthcare, affordable housing, education without debt, a living wage, equal justice. These are just the basic building blocks of human flourishing. And our work is to build this coalition, to demand those things, and elect leaders who will deliver them.
Thank you. Reverend, over to you.
Well, you know, in this moment, which Jon Ossoff very eloquently and powerfully describes, where we're pushing hard against the forces of division, who could have predicted that when the dust settled on November 3rd and the presidential race had been resolved, even though some are trying to pretend like it's not, there would be two runoffs and both would be in Georgia. And not only that, these two races would determine the balance of the Senate. And not only that, these two races coming out of Georgia would be led by a young Jewish man, a mentee of John Lewis, and, you know, not quite as young, but relatively young African-American man, the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, where Martin Luther King Jr. served, coming out of Georgia, the heart of the South. And so the nation is watching, and I think, as has been the case before, as goes the South, so goes the rest of the nation. It was true during the decades leading up to the Civil War, as we were having an important debate, the movement for abolitionism. It certainly was true in terms of the Civil War itself, true during decades of Jim Crow segregation, true during the Civil War. This is another, the Civil Rights Movement. This is another inflection point, and Georgia is literally the hinge that's going to swing the door to either a democracy that expands or continues the contraction that we've seen over the last 4 years. And you've got Jon Ossoff, young Jewish man, African-American pastor, running together with shared values, shared commitment. It reminds me And as I think about it, I think about Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, 2 Jews and an African American who died standing up, fighting for voting rights. I think about Martin Luther King Jr. and Abraham Joshua Heschel marching together. Heschel said, when I marched with Dr. King, I felt like my legs were praying. And in this moment, what we need is praying legs, praying feet, making it all the way to the ballot box, and then beyond the ballot box to principled engagement to redeem the soul of America.
Wonderful. Thank you. Let me turn to the issue that may be most prominent in the headlines today. Our discussion today occurs just before our community celebrates Hanukkah. And like almost every other holiday this year, it will take place against the background of an out of control pandemic, setting records daily for hospitalizations and deaths. It's keeping families and friends apart when we want to be together. It's forcing us to gather virtually like this rather than around tables and in our homes. As you look at the challenge facing the nation in recovering from COVID and the economic crisis that it has spawned, what will be your priorities as United States Senators? Reverend Warnock, I'll start with you.
Well, we've got to get this virus under control. And we have been insulted, but beyond the insult, just the tragedy, the human tragedy of spending all of these months with politicians laying out what they know they should know is a false choice between saving people's lives and saving the economy. The people are the economy. And so we need leadership. We need that will encourage people to follow the science, for God's sake. Wear a mask. Socially distance. These are things we can do now. We don't need to wait until we don't need President Biden in office to tell us to do it. We just do it. And in the Senate, I will be working hard to get this virus under control, to get the vaccine safely and efficiently distributed, to work with the private sector, the public sector to make sure that happens. I'm glad to see the appointments that we saw yesterday, at the CDC. We've got in other places, we're putting the doctors in control of the health rather than the politicians. And then we need relief. We need relief right now that centers workers and working families rather than only, the well-connected corporate interests. So I look forward to doing this work. It's a top priority. And then finally, I know when you're in the thick fog of war, and this is a war against a virus, you're so focused on survival. But I don't want us to be so focused merely on survival, and we take that seriously. When you think about just the human cost, how many lives we've lost, we'll be at 300,000 soon. To put that in perspective, we lost 3,000 people in 9/11. Think about what that did to the conscience of the nation. We're almost at 300,000, 3,000 a day. And so I understand the ways in which this is a weariness on the human spirit, but I think it's appropriate for us to start thinking and working now in such a way that we think not simply about survival, but how do we thrive on the other side of this pandemic. I think it's time to emerge from this and reinvest in America, reinvest in our infrastructure, roads, bridges, tunnels, green energy, green infrastructure, put the people back to work, and providing livable jobs with a livable wage and resetting our economy to compete into the future.
Great, thank you. Mr. Ossoff.
Well, I think the Reverend gave an excellent overview, and just perhaps to summarize, look, first of all, we got to control the spread of this virus. I mean, as the Reverend said, we're losing thousands of Americans per day, and we're losing thousands of Americans per day because of the arrogance of politicians who have, instead of basing policy on evidence and empiricism and science and medical expertise, deceived the people, put their short-term financial or political interests ahead of public health. We need to empower public health experts during a public health emergency. Georgia hosts the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the top epidemiological agency in the world. We need to resource the CDC to do its job. We need resources flowing to America's hospital systems, which are buckling under the weight of this outbreak right now. We need resources flowing to nursing homes, to clinics, to the US Public Health Service. We need to empower doctors and scientists to lead the way. My wife, I mentioned, as an OBGYN, she got sick in July with COVID, like so many healthcare heroes who have continued to serve the public despite the risk. She came home ill and was remotely consulting patients via telemedicine from home while recovering. We don't have that spirit in our political leadership. I mean, let me just make the point again for everybody out there. Did David Perdue run an anti-Semitic attack ad in which he lengthened my nose? Yes, he did. Was it disgusting? Yes, he did. Yes, it was. Has he apologized for it? No, he hasn't. That's nowhere near as disgusting, in my opinion, as the fact that he was profiting from this pandemic while opposing relief for ordinary people and undermining the public health response. So he may be an anti-Semite, but worse, he's corrupt, and even worse, he's been holding up help for regular people. He said this disease was no deadlier than the flu. He said the impact on our economy would be little. All the while, he was getting private briefings in Washington and buying shares in manufacturers of vaccines and medical equipment. That's like a cartoonish level of abuse, corruption, and incompetence. We need to listen to and empower public health experts. We need to rush direct financial relief to people who need it. We need to pass a major infrastructure, clean energy and jobs program so we can recover economically in the long term. The Reverend and I talk about this a lot as we campaign together across the state, that urban, suburban, and rural areas will benefit from major investment in infrastructure. We can unite people from disparate political ideologies and backgrounds to support a historic infrastructure bill, which will upgrade our transportation infrastructure, build new transit links, build rural electrification infrastructure, build new hospitals and clinics in underserved areas, clean up environmental contamination, make Georgia the #1 producer of clean energy in the South. All of that is where we can go from here. We can pass a new Civil Rights Act and advance criminal justice reform and continue the work that those heroes, John Lewis and others we've been honoring today, fought so hard to advance. The next 2 years can be the most productive for civil and voting rights since 1964, 1965. And we can look back on the nonviolent mobilization this summer in response to the killings of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and Rayshard Brooks and George Floyd. We can look back on that mobilization as having had the same impact as when Lewis and Boynton and Williams led hundreds across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. We can pass a new Civil Rights Act and a new Voting Rights Act. But here's the bottom line, everybody. Mitch McConnell is going to try to do to Joe and Kamala just like he tried to do to President Obama. It will be obstruction for its own sake. They will block COVID relief. They will block the public health response. They will block civil rights and voting rights legislation. We can't have paralysis at a moment of crisis like this. We need a good government. We need to enact legislation that helps people. And we got to win these 2 Senate races in Georgia to do it.
Thank you, Mr. Ossoff. Thank you, Reverend. We're nearing the end of our time here. And so I'm going to give each of you a chance for a couple of closing remarks. I was just thinking about last Saturday night, President Trump, who has not yet acknowledged his defeat, came down to Georgia, ostensibly to campaign for your opponents, although he spent most of the time complaining about non-existent voter fraud. You're going to get a lot more attention from the nation. I think President-elect Biden will be in Georgia. The fact that we have people from around the country joining us on this call today is an indicator of the incredible focus and attention on your races. So as you close, if you tell us just a little bit about what you think others who want to help you in your final 4 or 5 weeks of campaigning, I guess early voting is about to start, can do what you're looking for from your own supporters and the broader supporters represented around the country to help you. Mr. Ossoff, we'll start with you to close us out, and then I'll let you have the last word, Reverend Warnock.
And that is always wise to let the Reverend close. I encourage all of our hosts to do that. So I'll just be very brief, which is to say this. First of all, thank you again to JDCA. Thank you to you, Ambassador, for your service to the country and for moderating this discussion. Thank you, Halie. Thank you, Congressman Klein. Thank you, Michael, for convening us. Thank you, Jewish Democratic Women's Salon, for the work that you do. Thank you to just everybody who's here in support. We are building the most ambitious grassroots get out the vote effort in American history here in Georgia. I am deeply honored and full of joy and optimism to be running alongside a moral leader such as Reverend Raphael Warnock, grateful for his support, grateful for all that he has done for our community, grateful for the service that he will render in the United States Senate, grateful for all of our supporters here in Georgia who are working day and night to get us over the line in these two races. I wish everybody good health. I wish those who are observing and celebrating it a happy Hanukkah. I wish a peaceful rest of this year for you and your families, and humbly ask you to dig as deep as you can to support us. Sign up for a phone banking chip in a few bucks to help us get out the vote. The stakes are as high as they get, and it really puts wind in our sails to know that you have our backs. Thank you.
Thank you. Reverend.
Well, thank you so much. My thanks also to all of the groups that have pulled us together for this conversation. I'm grateful to the JDCA, and thank you, Ambassador Shapiro, for your service and for moderating this conversation this afternoon. Listen, we need your support. We're in the last 29 days, and the fight is going on here in Georgia, but all of us have a stake in this fight. Folks have been asking us about coming to Georgia. And if you take the midnight train to Georgia, take the virtual train. Go to our website and you can volunteer digitally. You can go to my website, warnock4georgia.com. John's website is electjon.com. We're each running our individual campaigns. We have to make our own case. And at the same time, we recognize the ways in which these two races are connected. And we've got to win both of these seats. And so we're pushing forward with a campaign for health, jobs, and justice. That's what this is about. None of the distracting code words that came up over and over again the other night, all of these distortions, all of these efforts to change the subject. This campaign is about health, jobs, and justice for the people. And as I think about that in closing, and nobody believes a Baptist preacher when he says, as I close, but usually they have 2 or 3 closings, but I only have one, I'm done. But as I close and think about this, I had the honor and sad duty of officiating the funeral of my parishioner, John Lewis, who, by the way, in the course of those days when we all remembered him, I remember Mitch McConnell standing a few feet away from John Lewis's coffin and talking about what a great man he was, offering pious platitudes. And the only thing that made it difficult for me to receive that was, as McConnell was giving those words, he knew that the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act had passed the House, and he was sitting on the man's life's work. If John Lewis represents anything, it's voting rights. And McConnell won't even put it up for a vote. And so we've got to win these 2 seats and stand up on behalf of future generations, to be sure, but also in memory of the boy from Troy who understood the importance of the Black Jewish coalition, and who, when he was crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge, I am sure he was not thinking to himself, well, one day I'm going to receive a Presidential Medal of Freedom. One day when I have my funeral, the whole country's going to stop and there'll be 3 presidents there from Democratic Party and the Republican Party, because, you know, that's going to happen one day. No, he didn't do it thinking that he was going to win a medal. He was probably wondering, was he going to survive that day? And yet he did it because it was right. He knew that all of us have to keep bending that arc towards justice. And so even as we go through these tough moments, I just say to all of us that we have to keep pushing. If John Lewis didn't give up, Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman laid it on the line, so many others, we have to keep bending that arc, and together we win. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Reverend Warnock. Thank you so much, Jon Ossoff. I think everyone who's participated today can see that we've got 2 inspiring candidates who are going to get in good trouble the way John Lewis preached. We wish you Godspeed. We wish you go from strength to strength, and we wish you on to victory on January 5th. You've got all of our support. I'm going to turn it back over to Halie. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you to John and to Reverend Warnock. We deeply appreciate you sharing your insight, your wisdom with all of us today. It was a great event. And I especially appreciate the call to action. And we encourage everyone on this call to join us on the midnight virtual train, or maybe a little earlier, to ensure people can pick up those phones, the midnight virtual train to Georgia. And over to Bobby Saferstein, our senior program advisor, to tell us how to get involved.
Thank you, Halie, and thank you, Ambassador Shapiro, Reverend Warnock, and Mr. Jon Ossoff for joining us here, and all of you for being a part of this incredibly important conversation. Please visit jewishdems.org to find out about all of our upcoming events, 25 phone banks, including tonight at 5:30 p.m. Eastern. Please join us and sign up. We also have another community conversation on Tuesday, December 22nd at 3 p.m. about the Black and Jewish communities of Atlanta. This event will feature a preview of Dr. Sherry Rogers' film, Shared Legacies, and include a conversation between former U.S. Ambassador to the UN and Atlanta Mayor Andrew Young, civil and human rights activist Reverend Dr. Gerald Durley, Rabbi Sandra Lawson, activist and founder of the Atlanta Black Jewish Coalition, Sherry Frank, and American Jewish Committee Atlanta Regional Director and AJC National Director of Black Jewish Relations, Dov Wilker. And this discussion will be moderated by former U.S. Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, Rabbi David Saferstein. So please make sure to mark your calendars for that and sign up. And go to jewishdems.org to be a part of all of our upcoming Hanukkah programs, including one this Sunday. We start this Thursday at 6 p.m. almost every single night. But this Sunday at 6 p.m., we will have live performances by Israeli artist David Broza and Peter Yarrow of Peter, Paul, and Mary. And on Monday, we'll have a wonderful opening from Atlanta-based Rabbi Joshua Lesser. Also, if you are still looking for Hanukkah gifts, please visit our store at jewishdems.org for all of your fun gifts for all 8 crazy nights. Lastly, if you are a Georgia resident, make sure, and you're abroad, make sure to visit votefromabroad.org/GA to make sure to request your ballots. Thank you so much again, and we look forward to you being a part of all of our efforts in Georgia. Thank you so much.
Thank you. With that, we'll end the program. It will be available on our website if you wanted to watch again. Thank you.